Okay, ladies, well, welcome to session 21. Can you believe it? We're almost done with this book. We have one more of Jen Wilkins' weeks of lessons left, but about 4 more of our lessons left. So 4 or 5. So today, for our minor prophet, we're focusing on Habakkuk. So if you get out your timeline, he is number 6 on the timeline. And so you can write his name on blank number 6. Okay. And then the date for him, we're assigning 640. I went with the date that was suggested by the Women's Study Bible. But if you looked at the Know Your Bible page for Habakkuk, it said about approximately 600. So all of these dates are, unless there is a specific event mentioned in the book, like in the 3rd year of King Cyrus or something, that we can definitely identify, we have to look for other clues. So that's why there's that little wavy approximately sign in front of each blank there. Anyway, I just went with 640.
What I got out of Google was 605, 597.
Yeah, so like I said, you're gonna get around those times. The important thing is, it was after the fall of Israel, we know that, but before the fall of Judah. So it was in that time period. Okay, now as far as where he lived, well, he did live in Judah. So on your map, you could draw a little whole stick man somewhere in Judah. I'm leaving the space around Jerusalem blank for now because there's going to be 2 prophets that I know specifically actually lived in Jerusalem. So just put Habakkuk anywhere. I put him down in this little other map, I'm sorry, Donna, there's 2 maps. Okay, well, let's go to your notes then, your lecture notes. And we've already dealt with timeline and map, so we'll go down to the next paragraph. It's headed An Unusual Book. And one thing that's unusual about it, the Women's Study Bible pointed out this fact: Habakkuk is unusual in that it never addresses the people of Judah directly. You know, like in contrast, when Jonah went to Nineveh, he said, unless you people repent, judgment will fall in 40 days. He was speaking directly to them face to face. The other prophets would be speaking to the people in their countries around them. But Habakkuk is never speaking directly to people, he's talking to God. It's in effect, we're getting a peek into his prayer book. Because the way the book is structured, there's just 3 little chapters. In the first chapter, you have a complaint. He's looking around him and seeing what a horrible situation they're in politically, and all the injustice that's going on, and all the evil, idolatry, and he's saying, God, why aren't you doing anything? There's all this stuff going on and you're doing nothing. And God responds to him and says, the answer's already on the way. I'm already sending people that are going to judge Judah for what they have done. I'm raising up the Chaldeans, which is another name for the Babylonians, and their army is going to come in. All this evil will be judged. Okay, so that brings us to chapter 2. And now Habakkuk he says, your solution is worse than the original problem. We know all about these Babylonians. They are vicious. They rape, they murder, they kill, they destroy, they do all these horrible things. They are far worse people than the people of Judah. How could it be right to let a less wicked nation be attacked by a more wicked nation? Where's the justice in that? Habakkuk is not pleased with the way that God is running his universe. But it's neat to see he can lay that out before God. And God just says, I want you to write this response down. Write the vision and make it plain. That I will deal with all evil in its time. Wait for the right time. So, and then the last chapter is a third prayer, but this time Habakkuk has found peace from the responses that God gives. He's still frightened because he knows the Babylonians are coming. This can't be good. It'd be like living in the Ukraine today, you know. He even says, I'm afraid, I'm shaking, but I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. In fact, I would like for us to look at, let's look at his first complaint, because it sounds like today's headlines. So if you have your Bibles or a Bible app, open up to Habakkuk chapter 1, and we're going to look at verses 2 to 5, and I'll read those. And so his first prayer is his complaint, how long, Lord, must I call for help? And you don't listen. And I cry out to you about violence, and you don't save. Why do you force me to look at injustice? Why do you tolerate wrongdoing? Oppression and violence are right in front of me. Strife is ongoing and conflict escalates. The law is ineffective and justice never emerges. For the wicked restrict the righteous, and justice comes out perverted. Have any of you felt like that in recent days? You know, this isn't right. Where's God in all this, you know? And God says, look at the nations and be utterly astounded, for something is taking place in your days. In other words, Habakkuk, you are going to see it. I'm raising up the Chaldeans, and they're going to come in, and they will judge Judah for all these things that you have rightly observed are going on. So then we come down to verse 12 of the first chapter, and here's his second prayer where he says, wait a minute. He says, aren't you from eternity, Yahweh my God? Lord, you appointed them to execute judgment. You destined them to punish us. Your eyes are too pure to look on evil, and you can't tolerate wrongdoing. So why do you tolerate those who are treacherous, meaning the Babylonians? Why are you silent when one who's wicked, the Babylonians, swallows up one who's more righteous than himself, us? You know, you've made mankind like the fish of the sea, and the Chaldeans pull them all up with the hook. You know, we're all going to die here. And but then I love what so he pours out just all this complaint to the Lord, but then I love how he starts chapter 2. After he's gotten this all out of his system, you might say, then he's kind of talking to himself, and he says, I'm going to stand at my guard post and station myself on the lookout tower. Well, what's he looking out for? I'm going to watch to see what he will say to me and what I should reply about my complaint. What do I tell everybody else when they ask me? And I know God's going to give me an answer. And God does. He says, write down this vision and clearly inscribe it on tablets so one may easily read it. For the vision is yet for the appointed time. And it testifies about the end and will not lie. And though it delays, wait for it, since it will certainly come and not be late. You know what it said about Jesus Christ and his birth? It says, at the right time, God sent forth his son, born of a woman. You know, at the right time. God has his time, and his time is always right. Wait for it. Don't fret yourself. And so in chapter 3, is Habakkuk's third prayer. And he says, Lord, I've heard the report about you, and I stand in awe of your deeds. Revive your work in these years and make it known in these years. In your wrath, remember mercy. And then let's jump down to verse 16. He's heard all these things that God does, this mighty, powerful God. He says, I heard and I trembled within. In other words, I'm afraid. I'm afraid, you know. My lips quivered at the sound. Rottenness entered my bones, and I trembled where I stood. The sound he's hearing is like of the army coming against them. And he says, it frightens me. Now I must quietly wait for the day of distress to come against the people invading us. I know that God's going to deal with them, and I just need to wait for it. And I love these next verses. Though the fig tree does not bud, and there's no fruit on the vines, though the olive crop fails, and there are no sheep in the pen and no cattle in the stalls, yet I will triumph in Yahweh. I will rejoice not in those things. I will rejoice in the God of my salvation. I love that. Even though there's no outward sign anywhere of anything good, I know I can trust God. And he says, Yahweh my Lord is my strength, and he makes my feet like those of a deer. How high can a deer jump?
Pretty high.
Pretty high. Before, he said, rottenness are in my bones, I can hardly even stand up, but God has made me be like a deer. And he enables me to walk on mountain heights like goats, that very sure-footed. So God is taking care of me. And then look at the very last line of this. He says, this is for the choir director. In other words, I want this prayer to be sung, and I want it accompanied by stringed instruments, like maybe a guitar, and a lovely young lady singing her song last Sunday. So how about that? He's got a little psalm right in the middle of this. So it is an unusual book, but a book that's very much for today and for us, and for our encouragement as much as it was for theirs. If we look at some of the key themes, the Women's Bible Study listed these, and I just thought if you don't have one of this, they're worth looking at. First theme is that God is just and merciful. He's both of those things, even though his people may not always understand his ways. Why are you doing this, Lord? I don't get it. It's all right. You just trust me, 2, wickedness will eventually be punished, and the righteous will ultimately see God's justice. Number 3, God uses some wicked nations to punish other wicked nations, but ultimately, God will judge all nations. And then the last one, there's a key phrase, there's a verse that we kind of skipped over, but the righteous shall live by his faith. Have you heard that thought before? Because it's quoted 3 times in the New Testament, giving 3 different aspects of salvation. So this one short little book, and yet 3 different writers. The writer of Romans, Paul, the writer of Galatians, I guess that was still Paul. And then whoever the writer of Hebrews was, refers to that phrase. And we've already discussed how his laments end with joy. Okay, then shifting gears to Bible Study Fellowship, their comments, and this brings us into the Joseph story again. We're aware of all these little tests that Joseph came up with for his brothers. And I don't think he was just being mean. It says God used those tests that he imposed on his brothers to reveal their willingness to protect their brother Benjamin and to honor their father Jacob. They haven't been known for either of those 2 qualities, honoring their dad or protecting the favored guys. And then his own heart attitude, and I thought this was very revealing, when that scene, that very emotional scene when Joseph finally reveals who he is to his brothers, and there's this reconciliation that begins to take place. Did you notice in that, he didn't ignore their sin or redefine it. He didn't cover it up or whitewash it or make it less than it was. He just said specifically, you sold me here, but God meant it for good. He was able to address their past offense without bitterness or resentment. It's almost like a matter-of-fact statement. And how was he able to do that? How was he able to acknowledge their sin without casting blame or without seeking retaliation, or not even recounting, you did this and you did this and this hurt me and that hurt me and then there was that time when you did this and, he didn't do any of that. How was that possible?
I think maybe he was thinking back at his dream he had when he was young, and he realized that God, this is his plan.
He realizes this is his plan. He's gone through a lot of trials since that. And God, through those trials, was revealing his overruling, redemptive purpose. God intended all along that Joseph was going to be the one that saved a lot of people's lives during this famine, and that began to bring reconciliation to a very dysfunctional family. And so when Joseph was young, he dreamed of his future power to rule. And now as he is ruling, he's ruling the way God wanted him to. His trials had deepened his desire to love others and to serve others, both Egyptians and hungry people from other countries, including his own family. And that love now exceeded any quest he may have had for power, position, or revenge. It's just God has been working in his heart all through this time, just to mold him into this man that he's become. And then the next thing about the family registry, I'd never heard this before, and I thought it was just interesting. Scripture lists Jacob's family who left Canaan, and the people on this list became the nation of Israel, the people of God. And then they carefully maintained legal registries, and those registries were the basis for the distribution of land in Canaan in Joshua's day. After they conquered the land, they divided it up among the tribes. They knew exactly who was who, And then accurate genealogical records were preserved up through the birth of Jesus. Jesus' genealogy was traced through these ancient records that had been preserved in the temple. Sadly, though, all legal records after the earthly life and ministry of Jesus Christ appear to have been lost in the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. If they do still exist, it's not generally known where they are. God knows, but we don't.
I got a question for you about
Sure,
that.
sure.
Why do you suppose Joseph wasn't named for one of the tribes instead of his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim?
Ephraim, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. I don't know why for sure. I do know this, the Levites did not get land. And so only 11 tribes got land if you don't have another tribe somewhere. And there's this, Joseph is the one that God gave the double blessing to.
Well, that's true.
Even though he wasn't appointed officially as the firstborn, he's the one who's in authority. Like the firstborn is supposed to take care of the family who's doing that. Joseph, and God put him there, and his two sons will receive, he gets a double portion.
That makes sense.
I mean, that's how I think of it.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's ever spelled out like that, but anyway.
Is this the Joseph that was married to Mary?
Yes. No. I'm
No,
sorry.
I didn't
This is
think
the
so.
Joseph in the Old Testament.
Okay.
One of the 12 sons of Jacob that was sold into slavery, yeah. But you can see why people would want to, there's probably lots of little Josephs in the land of
A lot of
Israel.
Marys.
A lot of Marys, yeah. So, anyway, so no, this is a different person, and yet an equally godly person. I think of the Mary's Joseph as a quiet man. You never hear him say anything. He just obeys with no qualms, no arguments, he just quietly does exactly what I asked him to do. Wow. Anyway, okay, and then this thing about Jacob's pilgrimage. This is when Joseph is formally presenting members of his family to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh looks at him, and old age is a compliment. It's a sign of God's blessing. So he says, "How old are you?" And he says, "The days of my pilgrimage have been few and difficult. I've had a long life, it's been hard." And he referred to it as a pilgrimage, and that they were few. Well, he was 130. We don't usually think of that as a few, but compared to some of his ancestors, it was a few. And he has indeed lived a hard life. Now, some of that was because he brought it on himself, but some of it was he was done to by other people. But what is a pilgrim anyway? It's a person that's traveling somewhere. He's in transit. And he's headed somewhere else than where he is right now. Isn't that us? We are pilgrims heading toward our eternity with Christ. This ain't our home. This world is not my home, just a traveling through. So anyway, so he was right. It's a pilgrimage that he's on. And then the last thought I thought was worth sharing. Jen Wilkin ended her last video with that beautiful list of comparisons, how Joseph is a type of Christ, you know, and that is true. But I like the perspective that the Bible Study Fellowship brought to that. Many have pointed to beautiful parallels between Joseph and Jesus. While God used Joseph greatly to accomplish his purposes, the person and work of Christ far exceed that of Joseph. And then, for example, Joseph suffered in slavery in prison and was exalted by God to save his people from extinction through famine. Whereas Jesus suffered on the cross and rose from the dead to save his people from sin and death. Joseph was used by God to preserve the people of the promised one who would come from the line of Judah. And Jesus is the Lion of Judah. Joseph was exalted to second in command in ancient Egypt. That was a very high position then. But Jesus is King of Kings, exalted to the highest place forever. And then I like the summary. Joseph is to be respected. Jesus is to be worshipped for eternity. I just thought that's a beautiful summary. It's good to stop and think about all those individual parallels between them, but then it's even better just to raise our hands and glory. Thank you, Jesus. Okay, so with that, let's look at days 4 and 5. So that starts on page 151 in your workbooks there. What does Joseph do? What's the last test he has for his brothers? Anybody have that one? What did he do?
He hides the money back in their bags of food.
Okay, so for the second time, he puts all their money back,
Yes,
and then he
puts
did
the silver cup in Benjamin's
in
bag.
Benjamin's bag. Now, why do you think he put the cup in Benjamin's bag and not somebody else's? Any ideas on why he did it?
Well, okay.
Benjamin was the one that the father did not want anything to happen to.
Okay.
And if Benjamin was the one that was going to be detained, then they would really be in trouble.
Okay, so he wants to see how are they going to respond to this. Bonnie, what were you going to say?
I can't remember.
Oh, okay.
But it was just, Benjamin was the most important one they wanted to protect. So they were probably afraid that Joseph would keep him and send them back.
And also, remember, Joseph is still seeing what are they like? How are they going to respond? Because he knows that way back when, they wanted to get rid of him. Now here's the perfect chance to have a guilt-free way to get rid of the other favored son. They can go back to Jacob and say, what could we do? The man, accused him, and there was the cup, and we couldn't do anything. And that is exactly not how they responded. Joseph sees that they've had a total change of heart. They could have even, Judah said, take me instead. The other brothers could have allowed that to happen. They could have gone back and left Judah, but they didn't. They all returned, even though it was only Benjamin, quote unquote, that was going to be a slave. So it was a very hard test, for them, because they think, we are toast, this is going to kill our father. And what are we going to do? But they all go back to try to resolve this thing.
It kind of also shows how respectful they are of their father
Now.
Yes, now,
as opposed to
Yes.
then, yeah. So it just reveals a lot of things that have changed, in their lives. Now, it's kind of interesting. Before the cup is discovered, and they say, what do they say? Let the person in whose bag is found die, and you can take the rest of us as slaves. You know, and then when they find out it's Benjamin,
It's like, wait a minute.
what have we
Yeah.
said? And the steward is quick to say, nobody's gonna die today, and I'll just take one slave. I'll just take him as my slave, which is almost as bad as far as they're concerned, but, you know. Anyway, then when faced with the horrible possibility that his father's favorite remaining son would become a slave, which of the brothers stands up?
Judah.
Judah. We always keep our eye on what is Judah doing. So all of them have had changes of heart, but it's most evident in Judah. And he offers himself. So if we go down, let's go to question 24, and this is probably the obvious one. We can answer in unison. By offering his own life in place of his brother, of which of his descendants does Judah remind you? Jesus, yes. And then he not only makes this plea to the steward, but he talks to Joseph face to face, you know, and makes an impassioned plea to allow himself to be taken in Benjamin's place. And it was in response to that then that Joseph revealed himself to his brothers. In question 26, what does Joseph say 3 times when he reveals himself?
God's will.
It was God's will.
Did
God
he
sent me.
speak in their language?
Well, I'm sure he did when he revealed himself.
Okay.
All the rest of this time, even though it reads like a face-to-face, one-on-one conversation, he actually was speaking through an interpreter.
Right.
But at this point, he doesn't need an interpreter. In fact, I think he says, everyone leave me. And then, everyone but the brothers. So when after all the Egyptians left, then he says, I'm Joseph, and I'm sure he said it in Hebrew, not in Egyptian. So, and I think that's another reason why they didn't recognize, the brothers didn't recognize Joseph, even though he recognized them. They all look like themselves, only older. He looks like something totally foreign. Jewish men had full beards. He's clean shaven. He may have even had his head shaved, I'm not really sure, but.
Yeah, I think they, either that or they wore wig things.
Yeah, anyway, he was dressed like an Egyptian, he spoke through an interpreter, so he really didn't even hear his voice, because probably it would be like, tell him that, and then the interpreter would speak out to them. But anyway, at this point, no, he doesn't need to speak through an interpreter, he can just.
And I think too, when we've seen pictures in the past, it shows Egyptian men with makeup on their eyes too.
Yep.
So.
And again, they weren't expecting to see Joseph,
Yeah.
and you tend not to see what you don't expect to see. It's one of those psychological things that our eyesight isn't all physical. It's partly how we think, what you see. All right, so Joseph says 3 times, God is the one. Even though you had something evil in your heart at the time, God meant it for good. God sent me here. God sent me here. Always, that's been his focus, is on God. And what plan does he propose for his family now that they know who he is?
To move to Egypt.
He wants them to move to Egypt. He says, I'll take care of you. He sends provisions for the trip. He sends wagons for the little kids and for the ancient father, they can ride there, doesn't have to walk. And he says, I like this. He says, settle near me. I want you to, we've been separated long enough. Let's be together for the rest of our lives, And then what final instruction does he give the brothers just before they start out?
Do not quarrel.
Don't quarrel. He knows them. So don't quarrel along the way. And when Jacob hears about this plan, he now no longer has any reservations, and he goes. So, That brings us to day 5, 124. So they start out on this journey, and they're bringing all their flocks and everything with them, I reckon. So it's not just like a quick trip. But anyway, they make it to Beersheba on their way, and what happens at Beersheba?
God speaks.
God speaks in response to
Offering
the
sacrifices.
offering. So Jacob offers a sacrifice again at Beersheba. This is where God has always spoken significantly to him. And once again, in response to that offering, God speaks to him and reassures him, it's okay for you to go to Egypt. I know that you have reservations because God wasn't pleased when Abraham went to Egypt. And God kept Isaac when he wanted to go, to Egypt. But, so Jacob would have had reservations about this. Wait a minute, you told us to dwell in Canaan, not in Egypt. But God says, this is part of my plan. It's okay now. It's okay, you go. And I'm going to make you into the great nation there. They went down to 70 people. How many came out?
Millions.
Millions, yeah. So he did make him into a great nation there. And he reiterates the promises that he's made, God does to them. Okay, let's go to question 33. The chart just had you fill out the names of everybody, and there were 70 people in all that are named or that are listed. The question 33, Joseph and his father are tearfully reunited after 22 years of separation. Where does Joseph want his family to live? Goshen. That's in a part of Egypt that's away from the capital and so on.
It's the most fertile land.
It's very fertile, so it's going to be a very good place for their flocks and herds. And what does he tell them to say? He tells them to tell the truth, but what does he say to say? What's your occupation?
Shepherd.
Shepherds.
They don't like farmers.
Well, keepers of livestock,
Yeah,
so that kind of encompasses
yeah,
everything.
yeah.
For
And it just made me think of the Hindu caste system. Egyptians must have regarded shepherds sort of like the sweepers or something are regarded in India, very low caste. And I think this is part of the way that God is protecting them. The Egyptians are going to leave them alone. They're not going to interact with them. Therefore, there's not going to be that temptation to intermarry. Therefore, they're not going to be closely associated and start worshiping idols. Because remember, Rachel brought idols with her, and apparently, until they buried them at Shechem, it's very easy to fall back into that. And God says, well, I'm just going to put a barrier of people, Egyptians holding their nose when they look at you, and I'll just protect you there. And allow them to become the great fertile nation that they were there. Okay, let's turn the page to 156. Jacob answers, we're back to this thing about him saying that my years of my pilgrimage are few and difficult and so on. Do you think, what does that tell you about the state of his heart? And I'm not sure that might be a tricky. He feels he's had a hard life, and he has. But he's actually lived more than a few years. I wonder if this is still part of Jacob being, poor me, coming through again. Not sure. But anyway, I'm not sure yet why Jen put that question in. So maybe when we hear the video next week, we'll get an answer to that one. Okay, but this was interesting. She asked you to compare the state of Jacob's family with the state of the Egyptians over the next 5 years and on of that famine.
Israel prospered.
Israel prospered. They acquired land. They were actually given land that became theirs. What happened to the Egyptians?
Oh, they were basically bought by Pharaoh.
Yeah, in the first year or two, all their money ran out. Okay, so comes the third year, we don't have any more money, you can have our livestock. Okay, so they lost all their livestock again. And then, the next year, the only thing we have left is our land and ourselves, so take our land and we'll be your slaves. You know,
So basically Pharaoh owned it all.
Pharaoh owned it all, you know? And whereas the Israelites were given land, and they were becoming very affluent. So, God has his way of guiding his people too.
It noted that they were provided seed,
Too.
and they planted that and became very fruitful and
Yeah.
multiplied.
So somehow during this time of famine, maybe right near the Nile or wherever this land of Goshen was, they still were able to get enough.
Probably were what, the phrase, land of Goshen.
Yeah. There you go.
I
There
remember
you
that
go.
on an old cowboy show like 50 years ago. Roy Rogers.
Okay, and then, remember that at the very end, when Jacob, he says, look, I'm coming here, I'm living here, but when I die, I want to be buried back in the family grave plot. I want to be buried in Canaan. And Joseph says, don't worry, Dad, I'll see to it. And that's exactly what happened.
What a burden that must have been though for the Israelites all those years, don't you think?
What do you mean?
I don't know, just, everything they had gone through after that, but to take care of Joseph's bones, they traveled through the wilderness. And
Yeah. Well, that was Joseph's,
like-
that's Joseph's bones, but this
That's
is
right,
Jacob.
yeah.
But you're right. Yeah, I mean, but the fact that they even preserved them or knew exactly where they were, I don't know if he was in a tomb or what, but they knew where his bones
They
were.
were in Egypt.
I know they were in Egypt.
They knew how to preserve.
Yeah, that's true. But anyway, because he was embalmed,
Yes.
but I mean, just keeping track of it for 400 years.
Yeah.
But, anyway, interesting things.
I read where like they put them somewhere until that everything rotted off, and then they put the bones in I can't remember the name of it. It's like a little
A sealed container of
Yeah.
some sort, yeah.
like made out of stone or something.
Yeah, the embalming process they used was very long, yeah. But, okay, well, that brings us to the end of this lesson. So you have your homework for next week, which is actually just to do the next little minor prophet, because we'll just have the video next week.
Thank you.